RA-ist gang humiliates Bumpy Johnson's sister. What 19-year-old Bumpy did in 3 hours shocked Harlem, the insult lands in public, meant to break bloodlines and invite chaos. Everyone expects Bumpy Johnson to explode, but the streets don't yet understand how quietly danger can move. Harlem didn't miss it. The insult was delivered where witnesses were unavoidable, where silence would look like agreement. Midday, storefronts open, people lingering. His sister stood still while men laughed too loud, their meaning sharpened by the way they took their time. They didn't touch her. They didn't need to. The words were enough. They were chosen to stain, to remind, to announce ownership where none existed. It was theater, stage for the street. Every pause asked the same question. How fast would Bumpy Johnson come running? News traveled without messengers. A butcher paused his knife. A barber stopped mid-stroke. Eyes lifted, then lowered. Everyone knew whose bloodline had been tested and why the test mattered. This wasn't about a woman standing alone. It was about whether a line could be crossed and left standing. Bumpy heard it without hearing it. He wasn't there, but the insult arrived intact, carried by breath and fear. He didn't ask for details. He didn't need names. The shape of it told him everything, the timing, the audience, the intention. Violence was the invitation. That was the design. A young man losing control, fists answering mouths, police summoned, a lesson written the wrong way. They wanted him predictable. They wanted him loud. He didn't move. Instead, he let the moment sit, heavy and visible. He let Harlem watch what patience looks like when it refuses to blink. Somewhere between the insult and the answer, 3 hours began to count down. And the men who laughed didn't know it yet, but the street had already chosen sides. No sirens yet, no fists raised, only a city holding its breath, measuring a young man by what he did not do, and waiting to see how restraint would reshape the night before dawn learned who truly commanded respect. Harlem had rules before it had laws. They were not written, but everyone knew where they lived. They lived in glances, in favors owed, in doors that opened or stayed shut. Bumpy Johnson learned those rules young, not from lectures, but from watching men who survived, men who spoke softly and were still obeyed, men whose power did not hurry. By 19, Bumpy already carried weight that didn't announce itself. He walked without escort, stood without posture, listened more than he spoke. People mistook that quiet for absence. They were wrong. Harlem watched him the way streets watch weather. Not curious, just alert. He paid debts on time. He remembered names. He corrected problems before they became stories. That was authority before the word ever touched his mouth. His sister was known, respected, protected without needing to be guarded. Not because of fear, but because of order. Order keeps chaos from getting ideas. The men who insulted her didn't misunderstand Harlem. They challenged it. They believed youth meant recklessness. They believed pain demanded speed. They believed a quick reaction was the only language a young man knew. Bumpy let them believe. In the hours after the insult, he moved calmly through familiar places. A pool hall, a restaurant backroom, a stoop where old men played dominoes and said nothing. He didn't threaten. He didn't promise. He asked questions that sounded like courtesy. Who was present? Who laughed? Who stayed quiet? Who looked away? The answers formed a map no one else could see. Respect, Bumpy understood, was never taken by force alone. It was borrowed, then returned with interest. Harlem wasn't waiting for violence. It was waiting for judgment. And as the city leaned in, something shifted. Not fear, recognition. A 19-year-old who did not rush was becoming something else. Someone who could decide what consequences looked like. Someone Harlem could trust to end things cleanly. He understood reputation traveled faster than fists and farther. That day, he borrowed silence like a weapon. He allowed rumors to run ahead of him, uncorrected, unfinished. Some said he was afraid. Others said he was waiting. Both stories serve him. Police cruisers rolled by slower than usual. Shop owners watched reflections in glass. Men who had smiled earlier stopped smiling. They sensed balance being weighed. By evening, Harlem knew one thing for certain. Whatever came next would not be messy. It would be precise. And precision frightened men who relied on noise. Because restraint creates witnesses, and witnesses remember. They remember who stayed calm when chaos was expected. They remember who protected without spectacle. That memory becomes currency. And Bumpy was quietly getting rich. The night hadn't decided yet, but Harlem already had. 3 hours stretched ahead, not as a countdown to violence, but as proof that patience, when seen by the right people, could rearrange power without spilling a single drop of blood in the street tonight alone. The insult had landed hours before, but Bumpy's presence was absent, calculated. 3 hours stretched over Harlem like a low fog, each minute measured in tension rather than motion. Every man who had laughed earlier now felt the street shift beneath him, though no fists had been raised and no sirens called. He moved quietly through alleys and back doors, through the parts of Harlem that carried whispers better than guns. A nod here, a question there, small gestures unnoticed by outsiders, observed by those who knew. By 19, Bumpy understood that power traveled in silence faster than it did in shouts. The city itself responded, bending in subtle ways to the weight of his restraint. Doors opened without knock, hands offered without request. Shopkeepers remembered debts settled years before. Old allies nodded from stoops. Every movement traced a map, invisible to those who didn't know how to read the streets. He wasn't making threats. He was making the city speak. The men who had humiliated his sister grew restless. They whispered among themselves, believing that inaction meant fear. They misread patience for weakness. They didn't see how every glance, every quiet step, tightened the noose of inevitability around them. Bumpy listened. He cataloged everything. Who had laughed, who had watched silently, who had turned their back. He asked nothing aloud. Every observation was a question that needed no answer. Yet Harlem answered anyway. Everyone revealed their place under his calm gaze, even from a distance. The power dynamic shifted with invisible weights and measures. Time in those 3 hours moved differently. Streets grew quieter. Tension settled like smoke into the corners of alleys and onto stoops. Men who had expected chaos felt their confidence eroding under the simple, unyielding truth. Bumpy Johnson did not react on their schedule. They could not force him to move, and the city reminded them of it. No one saw him plan, but his plan unfolded with each silent step. Every door opened, every whisper noted, every reaction tallied. The insult, intended to spark immediate fury, had instead become a trap of perception. The guilty grew careless, revealed alliances, and exposed fears. All of it was visible to Bumpy, invisible to anyone else. By the end of 3 hours, Harlem had taken sides without a single gunshot. The city itself had aligned in quiet preparation, ready for the reckoning that would come not with the noise of fists or sirens, but with the authority of one young man who moved faster in silence than any mob ever could in anger. It was a different kind of power, the kind that could humiliate without yelling, punish without striking, dominate without movement. 3 hours had taught the men who thought themselves bold that patience, observed by the right eyes, could be sharper than a blade, heavier than a gun, and more binding than fear. And in those 3 hours, Bumpy Johnson became more than 19. He became inevitable. By late afternoon, the men who had humiliated Bumpy's sister began to relax. They assumed the young man was still counting, that he was distant, that his patience would wear thin. They misjudged entirely. The city had already shifted under him. Every whispered conversation, every glance down a narrow street, every cautious step taken by onlookers formed a lattice of control that the offenders could not see but could feel. Bumpy returned quietly to the neighborhood, walking without escort, without signaling. His presence was subtle, a shadow in a doorway, a figure on the stoop, yet the very act of being there reframed the moment. The insult that had been designed to humiliate his family became a spectacle. Yes, but a spectacle for the wrong audience. The guilty, the careless, the overconfident were all there to witness the trap being set without realizing it. He let them breathe. He let them talk. He let arrogance fill the room and streets alike. Every boast, every laugh, every glance of superiority worked against them now. Harlem watched, silent but participatory, the way the city itself aligns when order is being reestablished. Allies began to appear, discreetly, almost invisibly. A barber who had swept floors years before now held a chair ready. A shopkeeper silently unlocked a back door. Even the children on the corner knew, without being told, to stay quiet. They sensed a reckoning arriving, not through violence, but inevitability. Bumpy's steps were measured, deliberate, nothing rushed. He entered the room where the insult had landed, the place that had been carefully observed, and the men inside stiffened. Eyes darted, palms brushed against hidden pockets, posture shifted. No gun was drawn, no voice raised. Yet fear, unmistakable, began to ripple through the space. He moved among them calmly, touching nothing, saying little. A subtle gesture, half a nod, a hand on a table, was enough to confirm what they already feared. Their miscalculation had been absolute. They had assumed a 19-year-old would respond as they expected, with haste and rage. They had assumed youth meant impulsiveness. But the trap was in restraint. Humiliation had been the bait, their overconfidence the hook. Harlem watched as Bumpy transformed the insult into leverage, turning public embarrassment into a silent court. The guilty revealed their priorities, their alliances, their weaknesses, without him needing to demand anything. Their mistakes were cataloged in real time, witnessed by the city itself. Outside, windows reflected the tension. A crowd had gathered without being asked, lingering in the shadows, leaning close to hear nothing but to see everything. They remembered who spoke softly and carried weight. They remembered who stayed calm while others fumbled, who required no shout to command attention. Inside, Bumpy stood at the center of the storm he had not yet raised. Silence pressed against the walls, thick and almost tangible. The insult had become a test of nerve, and every man in that room now failed. They were trapped by their own pride, their own assumptions. When he finally spoke, it was not anger, but a measured acknowledgement, enough to remind them of what mattered in Harlem. Control, not cruelty. Respect, not performance. Consequence, not chaos. The humiliation that had been meant to wound Bumpy's family became a lesson for the entire neighborhood. Every observer knew that power did not shout. By the time he left, the city had already recorded the verdict. The offenders were marked not by violence, but by their own errors. The trap had worked perfectly. The moment arrived precisely when everyone expected chaos. The men who had humiliated his sister believed that Bumpy's youth and the raw emotion they presumed he carried would erupt in fire, fists, and fury. They leaned forward, waited for the inevitable. They counted on impatience. They were wrong. Bumpy entered the room quietly, a measured presence that seemed to absorb every glance. His hands were empty, his posture relaxed, yet every nerve in the space stiffened as if touched by an unseen weight. No threat was shouted. No gun was drawn. The very air seemed to tense under the calm he projected. His eyes swept the room, noting those who had laughed too loudly, those who had smiled too broadly, those who had underestimated him. Recognition passed silently between Bumpy and the walls themselves. Harlem had always observed, and now it bore witness. The crowd knew what he would do before he did it, because his restraint had already spoken. Then he acted, not with rage, not with violence, but with precision. A hand placed on the table, deliberate and slow, drew the eye. A word, soft, delivered with a tone that carried unshakable authority, shifted the room. The men who had sought to provoke him realized, all at once, that the game had never been theirs to control. Fear spread like a shadow. It wasn't loud or desperate. It was quiet, insinuating. They understood that they had been outmaneuvered, their arrogance exposed. Every inch of their composure faltered under the pressure of calm they could not imitate. Bumpy's dominance was not in force, but in inevitability. The knowledge that consequences had been measured, rehearsed in silence, and would arrive precisely when they were ready to be acknowledged. The spectators absorbed the lesson. Harlem, as always, remembered. This was not violence for spectacle, but justice in the language the city respected. Controlled, deliberate, undeniable. The men who thought they could bait him into chaos now saw that restraint carried a sharper edge than anger. By the time Bumpy left, the room had transformed. Tension hung like a fine wire, fraying only in the minds of those who had sought to humiliate him. Power had been asserted without a single punch, without blood spilled in the streets. Authority had spoken through patience and calculation, and everyone present, enemies and allies alike, understood exactly who held it. In that room, at that hour, Bumpy Johnson became more than 19. He became an immovable presence, a force defined by calm, respected by loyalty, feared by arrogance, and remembered by the city he had silently protected. By nightfall, Harlem had returned to its usual rhythm, but nothing was the same. The insult, the humiliation, the fear, they had all been absorbed and processed by a single force of quiet authority. Bumpy's sister had been avenged, not with open violence, but with the more enduring power of respect and inevitability. In the alleys and on the stoops, whispers spread faster than the streetlights could illuminate. Men who had laughed earlier now walked cautiously, their assumptions dismantled. Shopkeepers recalled the subtle gestures, the nods, the presence that had commanded the neighborhood without a shout. Children on the corner mimicked the stance of a man who did not need to move quickly to control what mattered. Bumpy himself moved through the city as if nothing had changed. Yet Harlem remembered every step, every glance, every silence. His authority, earned through restraint and deliberate observation, now carried a weight beyond his years. Those who had sought to provoke him understood, in retrospect, that they had been punished without a hand raised against them. The streets had done it for him. Even the men who had humiliated his family months before could not forget. The lesson had been delivered with precision. Power does not need noise to assert itself, and vengeance does not need blood to be absolute. Bumpy had written the verdict with a language Harlem recognized: patience, control, and the subtle orchestration of fear and respect. As the city slept, the story became legend. Not the one in the papers, not the official version that called it a misunderstanding, but the one Harlem carried in memory. Bumpy Johnson had proved that dominance could be exercised without chaos, that a 19-year-old could command a neighborhood, and that legacy was built on quiet inevitability. The streets would whisper it for years. Every stoop, every corner, every shop front remembered the night the young man moved like a shadow, turned insult into instruction, and reminded the city who truly held the power. Bumpy Johnson's name, even unspoken, had become a statement, a force, a law in itself. Harlem's verdict was clear. Respect, once earned, cannot be taken, only remembered. And in that memory, Bumpy's influence would endure far longer than any fist or gun ever could.